He thought he was coming home to surprise his son, but instead, he walked into a moment that would change everything he thought he knew about being a father. It started with a quiet kitchen, the faint hiss of something cooking, and a little boy clinging to someone who wasn't supposed to matter this much, yet somehow already did. Before we step into the story, I'd love to know what's the most unexpected thing you've ever walked in on that stayed with you. Share in the comments. I read every one. And if you love heartfelt stories that turn judgment into respect and distance into connection, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. The late afternoon sky over the Ellison estate glowed in amber light, casting long shadows across the manicured driveway. Grant Ellison's tires crunched over the gravel, the familiar sound echoing through the air like the punctuation mark on a long journey. His mind, however, was already upstairs, picturing his 4-year-old son's face. It had been weeks, for long weeks, of late-night flights, endless boardrooms, and contracts signed in glass towers halfway across the world. Geneva, Paris, Milan, he'd been everywhere but home. The deal had closed the day early, and instead of celebrating in some penthouse bar, Grant had done something out of character. He caught the first flight back. He imagined Lucas spotting him from the hallway, dropping whatever toy he was holding and barreling toward her with that high-pitched laugh that used to echo in the kitchen. Grant even smiled at the thought, something rare these days. This was going to be their moment. The front door gave a soft creak as he stepped inside. The polished leather of his shoes whispered against the marble tiles, and the wheels of his sleek black suitcase rolled behind him with a quiet rattle. He wore his signature tailored white suit, the violet silk shirt beneath catching the light from the chandelier. Around his wrist, a platinum watch gleamed, another dealmaker's trophy. On the handle of his suitcase, tied neatly with a piece of ribbon, hung a small brown teddy bear, Lucas's favorite. Grant reached down and brushed the plush head with his fingers, feeling the way the fabric had thinned from years of hugging. The bear had been meant as a peace offering, a stand-in for the hugs Grant hadn't given lately. He walked deeper into the house, expecting to hear footsteps or the television. Instead, there was only the faint hiss of something cooking. Maybe the chef had started dinner early. When he reached the kitchen doorway, everything he'd pictured on the drive vanished. At the sink stood a young black woman he didn't recognize. She wore a dark t-shirt under a gray apron, her back slightly hunched. Her hands were braced on the edge of the counter, but her shoulders were shaking. Not the subtle tremor of someone cold, but the uneven rhythm of someone crying and trying to keep it in. Clinging to her back, arms wrapped tightly around her waist, legs hooked at her hips, was Lucas. His face was buried in her shoulder, small fists gripping the fabric of her shirt like he was holding on to the last piece of safety in the world. His cheeks were red, and even from the doorway, Grant could hear the muffled sobs. For a moment, Grant's mind refused to process the scene. He was a father. He was a safe place. But here was his son, his only son, wrapped around a stranger. His grip on the suitcase handle tightened, and something sharp twisted in his chest. Was this why Lucas hadn't been answering his calls lately? Was this why the nanny agency had been oddly vague on the phone? The sound of his voice, sharper than he intended, broke the stillness. Lucas. The woman startled, her head snapping toward him, tear-streaked cheeks, wide, startled eyes. For a split second, she looked like she'd been caught committing a crime. Lucas didn't turn immediately. When he finally lifted his face, his blue eyes were wet, his lower lip trembling. Then, in a voice cracked by sobs, he said, "Don't take her away." Grant blinked. The words landed like a punch, shoving every well-rehearsed reunion speech right out of his head. "I what?" he managed. The woman's voice wavered, low and apologetic. "I'm sorry, sir." He won't let go. Grant stepped into the kitchen, his gaze flicking between her and his son. Every part of him wanted to demand answers, to reclaim control of this strange, off-balance moment. Instead, he found himself frozen, still in the doorway of his own home, feeling like the intruder. Grant took another step into the kitchen, his polished shoes tapping lightly against the tile. He could hear the softness of a pot on the stove, smell the faint sting of something slightly burnt. Rice, maybe, but all that was background noise to the sight in front of him. Lucas still clung to the woman, refusing to release even an inch. His small hands, so pale against her dark shirt, looked desperate. She kept one arm around his legs while her other hand, trembling slightly, rubbed gentle circles on his back. "I'm Nia Monroe," she said at last, her voice quiet but steady. "The agency sent me when Ms. Rena left last month. We spoke on the phone twice, I think." Grant searched his memory. Yes, he remembered a polite, soft-spoken voice. He'd approve her file in a rush between meetings, thinking little of it. She was supposed to handle the basics, meals, school pickups, keeping the house in order. She wasn't supposed to be here like this. Be someone Lucas held on to, as if she were his lifeline. "What's going on?" Grant asked, his tone more measured now. Nia's lips pressed together for a moment. She glanced down at Lucas, who shook his head almost imperceptibly, like he was begging her not to say. But she did. "He has nightmares," she said softly. "Every night. Sometimes 2, 3 times. He wakes up crying, calling for someone, anyone, and there's no one else here." Grant's jaw tightened. The night staff. "Does their job," she cut in gently, "but not this. Not the kind of job that means sitting in the dark with a scared little boy until he falls asleep again. Not the kind that means singing off-key just to hear him laugh. That's not in their description." Grant felt the words land heavier than they should. He hadn't thought about it. Not really. He assumed Lucas was fine, busy with his toys, school, and the staff he paid so well. "I'm not," Nia began, then stopped. Her eyes glistened, but her posture stayed firm. "I'm not trying to take anyone's place, Mr. Ellison. I'm here to make sure he feels safe. That's all." Lucas's grip on her tightened, like her words might be a rope keeping him from falling. Grant's gaze drifted to his son's face. The boy's cheeks were still wet. His hair stuck up at odd angles, like he'd been rubbing his head against her shirt for a while. "You've been crying too," Grant noted quietly. Nia hesitated. "Because earlier today, he told me he wished I was his mom." The air in the room seemed to shift, heavier somehow. Grant blinked, the sentence replaying in his mind. Lucas buried his face again in her shoulder, clearly wishing he could pull the words back, but also unwilling to let go of her. "I didn't know what to say," Nia continued. "I just held him. And then I cried, too, because no little boy should have to feel like the person they need most is missing from their life." Grant felt something crack inside, a pressure he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. He'd been so sure the overseas deal was the right choice, that it would secure Lucas's future. But looking at him now, arms locked around someone else, he wasn't sure at all. Nia adjusted Lucas on her hip, so she could meet Grant's eyes. "I'm not asking to stay," she said. "I'm just telling you what's been happening. I think you deserve to know." For a long moment, Grant didn't speak. He just looked at the two of them, the stranger and the son, who wasn't acting like Grant was home at all. And instead of the defensiveness he'd expected to feel, something else started to settle in. Awe. Here was a woman who had stepped into a job meant to be invisible and, without asking for permission, had become the most important person in his son's day. Grant leaned against the kitchen island, his fingers curling loosely over the cool marble edge. He didn't trust his voice yet, so he kept his eyes on Lucas, small, tired, and pressed so close to Nia that it was hard to tell where the boy ended and she began. In his mind, a montage started to play. The long hours in conference rooms, the midnight flights, the self-congratulating texts he'd sent his assistant after another flawless negotiation. And now, the silent footage of his son's life without him, empty hallways, missed bedtime stories, night terrors face alone except for the woman now holding him. "You said he has nightmares," Grant finally said, his voice quieter than before. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Nia gave him a look, steady, almost sad. "Who would have listened, sir? You were in Geneva or Dubai or wherever people go when they can't sleep in their own beds." The words were soft, but they sliced clean. Lucas shifted at the sound of them, and Nia's hand instinctively moved to smooth his hair, whispering something Grant couldn't hear. "I'm not mad at him," Grant said quickly, realizing his son might be misreading the tension. Nia straightened and met his eyes. "Then show him." Her tone wasn't defiant, it was protective. She wasn't trying to embarrass him. She was making it clear that Lucas's heart wasn't a puzzle to solve with gifts or promises. "He's 4, she continued. "He can't decode your silence." All he knows is you leave, and you come back with teddy bears instead of hugs. Grant looked down at the small brown bear tied to his suitcase. It suddenly seemed like a poor substitute for the father who should have been there. I worked 18-hour days for 4 weeks straight, he murmured, almost to himself. I thought if I secured that deal, it would pay for his future, college security, a life with no limits. Nia's voice softened, but there was no mistaking the truth in it. He doesn't understand college, Mr. Ellison. He just wants pancakes on Saturday mornings. Someone to clap when he jumps off the couch. Someone who listens when he's scared. Grant's throat tightened. He dominated boardrooms, persuaded entire committees to see things his way. But here, in his own kitchen, he was the one being persuaded. Without a single spreadsheet or contract in sight, Lucas finally peeked up at him, eyes uncertain. Grant crouched slightly, lowering himself to Lucas's level. "Hey, buddy," he said gently. "Come here." The boy hesitated, glancing between Nia and his father. He didn't run forward like Grant had imagined on the drive home. Instead, he stepped slowly, like someone testing an unfamiliar bridge. When Lucas finally reached him, Grant didn't scoop him up in a grand gesture. He simply opened his arms, and the boy eased into them. No sudden movement, no rush, just a cautious melt into the space that had been waiting for him. Grant closed his eyes and held him, feeling the uneven rhythm of his small breaths against his chest. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't know how lonely you were." Lucas's voice was small, but the words were sharp. "Don't make her leave." Grant opened his eyes and looked at Nia. Her own eyes glistened, but she didn't move, didn't even wipe the tears away. "I don't want her to leave either," Grant said softly. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't even a decision he'd thought through. It was instinct, born from the respect that had been quietly building from the moment he walked into the kitchen. In that instant, Grant knew something had shifted in him. This wasn't about hiring help anymore. It was about keeping the one person who had done for Lucas what he hadn't managed to do himself, make him feel safe. The kitchen felt quieter now, though the steady hum of the refrigerator and the soft hiss from the stove still lingered. Grant stood with Lucas still in his arms. The boys weighed a grounding presence. Nia remained where she was, her posture straight, her expression somewhere between guarded and exhausted. Grant loosened his hold just enough for Lucas to slide down the floor, but the boy stayed pressed against his leg. One of his small hands gripped the fabric of Grant's trousers. The other still curled toward Nia, like he couldn't decide which of them he needed more. Grant glanced down at him, then back to her. "I meant what I said," he began. His voice didn't have the polished sharpness it carried in the boardroom. It was slower, careful, almost unfamiliar to him. "I don't want you to leave." Nia's brow furrowed. "Mr. Ellison." "Grant," he interrupted. The name felt strange on his own tongue when offered so openly. "Call me Grant. And I'm serious. Not just as the help. As someone who clearly knows my son better than I bothered to in the last month." Her eyes widened slightly, as if she wasn't sure whether she'd just been complimented or accused. "I'm not sure that's—" "It is," he cut in again, but more gently this time. "You've been here for him in ways I didn't even realize he needed. You stepped in, no hesitation, and you gave him something money can't buy." Lucas looked up at him then, his voice quiet but certain. "She makes me pancakes." Grant almost laughed, a short, incredulous sound that softened into a smile. "That is actually a pretty big deal," he admitted. Nia's lips twitched like she might smile too, but she shook her head. "I don't want to cross any lines. You hired me for a job and—" "Cross them," Grant said without hesitation. "If that's what it takes for him to feel safe again. If that's what it takes for me to learn how to be the kind of father he actually needs." The word hung there, heavier than either of them expected. From somewhere deep in the house, the old clock in the hallway chimed softly. The moment felt unhurried, almost suspended in the air. "I can't promise I'll always get it right," Grant continued, "but I can promise I'm going to be here more. And I'd like you to be part of that. If you want to." Nia glanced down at Lucas, whose eyes were locked on her face, silently pleading. She smoothed the boy's hair again, a gesture so natural that Grant realized she'd probably done it hundreds of times in the past weeks. "I want to help him," she said slowly. "But this isn't a normal arrangement. Grant nodded. Good. Normal hasn't been working for us. That pulled the smallest laugh out of her, just enough to break the tension. Lucas took a step closer to her, then back toward his father, as though he was already imagining the three of them in the same space. All right, Nia said finally, her voice carrying the quiet weight of a decision made. I'll stay, but only if we do this as a team. Grant felt something loosen in his chest. Deal. In his world, deals were inked with signatures and sealed with handshakes. This one was signed by the sight of Lucas's smile, the first real smile he'd seen from his son in weeks. The pot on the stove gave a loud pop, snapping them all out of the moment. Nia turned quickly, lifting it from the heat before whatever was inside burned beyond saving. I'm guessing that's not pancakes, Grant said lightly. No, Nia replied, setting the pot down. But there's still time before dinner, and we have ingredients. Grant glanced at Lucas. What do you think, buddy? Pancake for dinner? Lucas's eyes lit up, and for the first time that day, he let go of both of them, darting toward the pantry. Grant and Nia exchanged a glance. No contracts, no formalities. Just a silent acknowledgement that something had changed here, and it wasn't going back. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the wide kitchen windows, soft and golden, carrying the faint scent of maple syrup and butter. For once, Grant was the first one downstairs. He'd traded a suit for a simple t-shirt and jeans, clothes that didn't scream business trip, but instead felt like they belonged at a home. He was at the stove, turning pancakes one by one on the skillet, when he heard footsteps. Lucas appeared in the doorway, hair sticking up in every direction, clutching his teddy bear by the arm. The boy's eyes widened when he saw his father at the stove. Morning, buddy, Grant said, flipping a pancake with exaggerated flair. Guess what's for breakfast? Lucas's lips curved into a slow grin. Pancakes. Bingo. Before Grant could say more, Nia walked in, tied her apron as she crossed the room. She froze for just a second at the sight of him cooking, but her face quickly softened. I didn't know you could cook, she said with a small smile. I can't, Grant admitted, but I can follow directions, and apparently the box mix counts as cooking in some circles. Nia chuckled, moving to the counter to set out plates. Lucas climbed onto a stool at the island, eyes bright and expectant. They worked together in easy silence. Grant plating pancakes, Nia slicing strawberries, Lucas sneaking one when he thought no one was looking. It was a kind of ordinary morning Grant realized he'd been missing. Something so simple, yet worth more than any of the million-dollar deals he'd chased. As they sat down to eat, Grant watched Lucas chatter between bites, a pancake mustache forming at the corners of his mouth. He noticed how naturally Lucas looked to Nia when he wanted more syrup, and how easily she anticipated without him saying a word. It struck Grant that this small domestic rhythm, was a foundation Lucas had been craving. After breakfast, Lucas ran to the living room to build a fort out of couch cushions, inviting both of them to join. Grant found himself on the floor, holding up one side of the roof, while Nia draped a blanket across. They laughed when the whole thing collapsed, Lucas giggling so hard he rolled onto his back. Later, as Lucas sprawled out coloring, Grant stepped aside to where Nia was wiping down the counter. You know, he said quietly, yesterday I thought I was hiring help. Now I realize I was finding family. Nia glanced at him, her eyes warm but measured. I'm still your employee, Grant. Maybe on paper, he replied, but not to him. And honestly, not to me either. Not anymore. The words hung there for a beat before she looked away, a small smile tugging at her lips. By the time the afternoon sun began to sink, Lucas was curled up on the couch between them, his head against Nia's arm, his feet stretched across Grant's lap. The television played quietly in the background, but none of them were really watching. Grant found himself memorizing the moment, the weight of his son's small feet, the calm in the room, the way Nia's shoulders had finally relaxed. He knew there would still be business trips, deadlines, and long days ahead. But there would also be mornings like this, forts made of blankets and pancakes for dinner just because they felt like it. And as Lucas drifted to sleep, Grant caught Nia's eye over his head. No words were needed. The understanding was already there. This was a new beginning for all three of them. That night, after Lucas had been tucked into bed and the house had settled into its gentle nighttime hum, Grant stood in the doorway of his son's room. The soft glow of the nightlight painted the walls in amber, casting long shadows over the teddy bear clutched in Lucas's arms. Nia was seated on the edge of the bed, humming softly. Her voice wasn't perfect, but was steady, and Lucas's small hand rested loosely against hers. Grant didn't step inside. He just watched, letting the moment carve itself into his memory. This wasn't the life he had planned, but maybe it was the life he needed. The one where love was measured in lullabies, warm breakfasts, and the quiet promise of never leaving someone to face the dark alone. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear what moment stayed with you most. Was it the pancakes, the blanket fort, or the quiet promise at the end? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one. And if you believe more people should hear stories like this, give a thumbs up and subscribe to Poetic Justice Stories so you don't miss the next one.